My name is Jhon, and welcome to Plane Crashed, where we uncover the most haunting and fascinating stories in aviation history. Tonight, we journey deep into the mystery of Air France Flight 447, a tragedy that shattered the myth of modern aviation's invincibility. It was called the Titanic of the skies, a flight that vanished without a trace over the vast, dark Atlantic Ocean, leaving behind 228 souls and a trail of unanswered questions. This is not just the story of a crash, it's the story of confusion, fear, and the desperate fight to understand how a routine flight could simply disappear. On the night of May 31st, 2009, the world watched the departure of Air France Flight 447 with little thought that it would soon become one of the most mysterious tragedies in aviation history. The Airbus A330 stood poised on the runway of Rio de Janeiro's Galeão International Airport, gleaming beneath the orange glow of the terminal lights as passengers boarded. Unaware, they were stepping into a story that would forever be etched into the chronicles of flight. It was supposed to be a smooth overnight journey to Paris, an elegant crossing of the Atlantic that thousands of aircraft make every day. Among the 228 people on board were families returning from vacations, business travelers preparing for meetings, and crew members who had done this route countless times before. As the cabin lights dimmed and the engines roared to life, the aircraft lifted gracefully into the night sky, carving a silver trail over the Brazilian coastline. Inside the cockpit sat Captain Marc Dubois, a veteran with over 11,000 flight hours, alongside two younger co-pilots, Pierre-Cédric Bonin and David Robert. It was routine, calm and professional, three men confident in their training, supported by the latest in aviation technology. Yet as the city lights faded behind them and the dark expanse of the Atlantic opened ahead, a silent chain of events had already begun that would soon test every limit of human judgment and machine reliability. High above the Earth at 35,000 feet, the aircraft cruised smoothly through the night. Passengers slept, flight attendants quietly served drinks, and the pilots monitored instruments glowing in soft hues of green and amber. But this part of the world, near the equator, was notorious among aviators for something called the Intertropical Convergence Zone, a vast belt of stormy weather where warm and cold air masses collide, creating violent thunderstorms that tower miles into the sky. As Air France 447 approached this invisible danger zone, satellite images showed an area dense with storm cells, their anvil-shaped tops lit intermittently by flashes of lightning. It wasn't unusual. Every pilot flying from South America to Europe expected to navigate through such conditions. The radar glowed with patches of red and yellow as the plane began to weave slightly to avoid the heaviest clouds. The passengers felt only a gentle bump here and there, but the cockpit began to hum with subtle tension. The crew activated the seatbelt sign and dimmed the lights further as rain began to streak across the cockpit windows. At around 2:10 a.m. UTC, the aircraft entered a dense storm cloud. Inside, water droplets turned to tiny crystals of ice, swirling around the fuselage, clinging to the sensors and coating the windshield with mist. Suddenly, a seemingly insignificant but catastrophic failure occurred. The plane's pitot tubes, small sensors that measure airspeed, began to freeze. Within seconds, the flight computers received conflicting data. Airspeed readings became erratic, alarms began to sound, and the autopilot, unable to trust its sensors, suddenly disconnected. What had been a serene cruise instantly transformed into chaos. In the dark cockpit, with turbulence shaking the plane, the pilots were now flying manually through one of the most dangerous weather systems on Earth, with unreliable instruments and no visual reference outside. Bonin, the youngest co-pilot, gripped the side stick and tried to maintain control, but without accurate airspeed, the aircraft's delicate balance between lift and drag became a guessing game. The Airbus A330 was a marvel of technology, built to assist, to protect, to correct human error. But in this moment, its greatest strength became its weakness. The automation that usually kept pilots safe now left them exposed. The stall warnings began to blare. "Stall, stall," a voice repeated, cold and mechanical. But confusion reigned. The pilots couldn't believe the plane was stalling. The nose was pointed upward, engines roaring, yet their instincts told them they were climbing, not falling. Bodnin, in an attempt to keep the aircraft stable, pulled the nose up further, trying to gain altitude, but that was exactly the opposite of what was needed. In the darkness, the plane began to lose lift. The air thinned. The wings struggled to bite into the sky. Within moments, the aircraft began to rise sharply before losing momentum and starting to sink. Its nose still pointed upward, engines still pushing hard. The stall warning continued to scream, then stopped, then returned, adding to the confusion. The crew's training hadn't fully prepared them for this. The complete loss of reliable airspeed at high altitude, in severe turbulence, with multiple systems malfunctioning. The captain, who had been resting, rushed back into the cockpit, but by then precious minutes had passed. The airplane was descending rapidly through the storm, its path erratic, its fate almost sealed. The flight recorders later revealed the haunting final minutes. The aircraft dropped from 38,000 feet to the ocean below in just over 4 minutes. The stall warning echoed relentlessly, and the pilots struggled desperately to understand what was happening. Despite their efforts, they never realized the plane was in a sustained aerodynamic stall. The engines were running perfectly. The aircraft was structurally sound, but it was falling through the sky, wings too steep, nose too high, trapped in a deadly state of lift loss. Passengers likely felt the aircraft shaking violently, the sense of weightlessness as it fell through pockets of air, the flashes of lightning illuminating the cabin in ghostly bursts. In the cockpit, the alarms overlapped. Stall, terrain, pull up. The chaos of sound masking the logic of what the aircraft was trying to tell them. At 2:14 a.m., the plane plummeted below radar coverage, vanishing into the darkness of the Atlantic Ocean. There was no distress call, no SOS, just silence. One moment it was there, an icon on a radar screen, and the next it was gone. On the ground, air traffic controllers tried to re-establish contact, calling again and again with no response. Hours later, when the plane failed to arrive in Paris, hope began to fade. Search operations were launched across the Atlantic, involving dozens of ships and aircraft. For days, nothing was found. No debris, no signals, no clues. The ocean had swallowed its secrets. Families gathered in airports, clinging to the faint hope that maybe, somehow, there had been an emergency landing, that perhaps survivors were floating in lifeboats, waiting to be rescued. But deep down they knew. When fragments of wreckage finally began to appear, seat cushions, pieces of fuselage, small bits of luggage, it confirmed their worst fears. Air France Flight 447 had crashed into the Atlantic, killing everyone on board. Yet the biggest question remained unanswered. How could a modern aircraft, equipped with redundant systems and flown by trained professionals, simply fall from the sky? The haunting truth lay hidden beneath 13,000 feet of ocean water, where the wreckage rested silently for 2 years before being discovered. When investigators finally retrieved the black boxes, they uncovered a chilling narrative, not of mechanical failure, but of human confusion, system design flaws, and the deadly intersection of trust and technology. The haunting disappearance of Flight 447 was not just a tragedy of lives lost, but a turning point for aviation. It exposed the fragility of even the most advanced systems when faced with the unpredictability of nature and the limits of human understanding. For the families, it was the end of a long, painful wait. For the aviation world, it was a wake-up call, a reminder that even in an age of precision, there are still places where uncertainty rules the skies, and where a single frozen sensor can unravel everything. The disappearance of Air France Flight 447 set in motion one of the most complex and emotional investigations in aviation history, a search not only for wreckage, but for understanding. When the plane vanished into the Atlantic, investigators were left with almost nothing. No distress call, no survivors, and an ocean covering every trace of evidence. For the families of the 228 victims, the uncertainty was unbearable. For months, search ships combed vast stretches of the ocean, guided only by weak satellite data and fading hopes. It took 5 agonizing days before the first pieces of debris were spotted, floating fragments of fuselage, seat cushions, and a few bodies gently carried by ocean currents, but those fragments were not enough to explain what had happened. Investigators needed the black boxes, the cockpit voice recorder, and the flight data recorder. Yet those lay somewhere at the bottom of the Atlantic, nearly 4 kilometers deep, in a region so remote and hostile that even submarines struggled to reach it. The French Bureau of Inquiry and Analysis for Civil Aviation Safety, known as BA, led the investigation, and for months they faced frustration at every turn. Early theories ranged from lightning strikes to terrorism, from catastrophic structural failure to sudden turbulence. Each day brought speculation but no answers. For families waiting in Paris and Rio, it was torture. How could a modern airliner simply vanish? How could the most sophisticated system in aviation give no warning at all? The first real clues came when floating debris began to reveal burn marks and fractures consistent with high-speed impact, suggesting the plane hit the ocean intact, not in pieces. This ruled out an explosion or mid-air breakup. It meant the aircraft had been under control or at least intact until the final moments. But that only deepened the mystery. What could make a perfectly functional plane plunge nose up into the sea at full speed? As weeks turned into months, the trail went cold. The black box's locator beacons, which emit signals for 30 days, fell silent. The ocean floor was too deep and rugged for traditional sonar, littered with ridges and underwater mountains. The investigation became one of endurance, a marathon against time, pressure, and the weight of expectation. Multiple search phases were launched, each costing millions of dollars, using underwater drones, sonar mapping, and robotic submersibles. Still nothing. It wasn't until nearly 2 years later, in April 2011, that a breakthrough came. A small French research ship, using advanced deep-sea scanning technology, finally located the wreckage. Scattered across the seabed lay the twisted remains of the Airbus A330, wings broken, fuselage fragments spread over a vast area, but eerily intact in many sections. Among the debris, searchers found what they had been desperate for: the black boxes, remarkably well preserved after years in the crushing depths. When they were brought to the surface and decoded, the world finally began to understand the tragedy that had unfolded inside that cockpit. The recordings revealed a chilling sequence of confusion and human struggle. At 2:10 a.m., the autopilot had disengaged after the pitot tubes, small devices that measure airspeed, became clogged by ice crystals. Deprived of reliable speed data, the flight computers shut off automation, leaving the pilots to fly manually. In theory, this was a basic scenario pilots were trained to handle. In reality, it was a perfect storm of stress, disorientation, and conflicting information. The cockpit voice recorder captured the pilot's disbelief as alarms began to sound. Bonin, the junior co-pilot, took control. "I have the controls," he said, but within seconds the aircraft began to pitch upward. A stall warning blared. "Stall, stall." In aviation, a stall doesn't mean the engines stop. It means the wings have lost lift, the airflow disrupted by too high an angle of attack. The remedy is simple in concept. Push the nose down to regain speed, but at high altitude in turbulence, with unreliable readings and no visual horizon, human instincts betray reason. The pilots felt the aircraft shaking violently. To them, it seemed they were falling, so Bonin pulled back harder on the control stick, unknowingly worsening the situation. The Airbus A330, unlike older planes, uses a side stick system that doesn't show the other pilot's movements. Bonin was pulling up, while the other pilot, David Robert, occasionally tried to correct by pushing down, but the controls didn't communicate this conflict. The captain, who returned to the cockpit after the crisis began, was never fully briefed on what had happened in those crucial first moments. He didn't realize that Bonin was still pulling back on the stick, keeping the nose high. The stall warning continued until the aircraft descended below the threshold where sensors could no longer measure airflow. The voice that had echoed through the cockpit fell silent, not because the plane had recovered, but because it was now plummeting through the sky, wings stalled, engines screaming. The data recorder showed the plane falling from 38,000 feet to 10,000 feet in less than 3 minutes. The pilots never recognized they were in a full aerodynamic stall. They believed their instruments were lying, that they were diving too fast, when in truth they were sinking like a stone. Even as the ocean rushed closer, Bonin kept the stick pulled back. The captain's final words were chilling in their simplicity. "No, no, no, don't climb." The response, "But I'm not climbing." Moments later, the recording ended. When investigators analyzed the data, the verdict was devastating. Not a single major mechanical failure caused the crash. The engines were functioning perfectly. The aircraft was airworthy. The pitot tube icing triggered the chain of confusion, but it was human misunderstanding, poor communication, and training gaps that sealed the fate of the flight. The findings sent shockwaves through the aviation world. For decades, technology had been built to make flying safer, but this incident revealed a paradox. As systems grew more automated, pilots were becoming less practiced in handling emergencies manually. They were trained to manage computers, not to fly without them. The Air France 447 disaster exposed a critical flaw in modern aviation philosophy. Over-reliance on automation had eroded basic airmanship. In the months that followed, international aviation authorities launched sweeping reviews of pilot training programs. Airlines began emphasizing manual flying proficiency once again, ensuring pilots could recognize and recover from stalls instinctively. Airbus redesigned pitot tubes to be more resistant to ice, and training simulators were updated to replicate high-altitude stall scenarios more realistically. The tragedy also sparked debates about cockpit design. Why hadn't the side stick controls shown each pilot's inputs? Why were stall warnings confusing and inconsistent? Why did the flight computers allow conflicting control inputs to cancel each other out? These questions drove changes in how aircraft were built, how crews were trained, and how information was displayed in moments of crisis. But beyond technical reforms, the emotional toll of the investigation lingered for years. Families who had waited in silence finally learned what happened, yet closure was bittersweet. Listening to the final recordings, many were haunted by the thought that their loved ones' deaths could have been prevented if just one action had been different. If one pilot had pushed the nose down, if one warning had been clearer, if one tube hadn't frozen. The term, the Titanic of the skies, became a symbol not of hubris, but of tragedy born from complexity, the idea that human beings, despite their brilliance, can still be undone by the very technology designed to protect them. The crash changed aviation forever, leading to fundamental shifts in how pilots interact with machines. The emphasis moved from blind trust in automation to a balanced partnership, one where pilots must always understand what the machine is doing and why. For investigators, the case of Flight 447 became a textbook study in human factors, the subtle psychology of stress, confusion, and decision-making under pressure. They realized that accidents rarely come from one failure. They emerge from a chain of small, interconnected errors that once in motion are almost impossible to stop. Air France Flight 447 taught the world that safety is not just about stronger machines, but about stronger understanding between man and machine. The ocean eventually gave up its secrets, but at a terrible cost. A reminder that even in an age of advanced technology, nature and human imperfection can still conspire to bring down giants of the sky. The final report, released by BEA in 2012, was as much a warning as it was a conclusion. It called for a re-examination of pilot training, greater transparency in cockpit communication, and clearer, more intuitive alert systems. It acknowledged that technology had advanced faster than human adaptability, creating a dangerous gap between automation and instinct. The lessons from that night are now woven into every pilot's education, every simulator, every checklist before takeoff. And yet, for those who lost someone on that flight, no amount of lessons or reforms could fill the silence left behind. Somewhere deep in the Atlantic, the wreckage of Air France Flight 447 still rests, a monument to human vulnerability in the face of nature's vastness, and a solemn reminder that even the most sophisticated aircraft can fall when trust, training, and technology collide.